Welcome to the European Parliament here in Brussels and a new episode of the European Report. We are especially happy to be back in Brussels today, considering the very difficult conditions and circumstances that we are living in Europe right now, and that also applies for the European Parliament. My name is Tomas Sandell. I'm the founding director of the European Coalition for Israel, and I'm stepping in today for our journalist moderator, Marco Gompaci, who we hope will join us again next week. With me in the studio today on my right-hand side, I have Dr. Sara Bazoobandi. Sara grew up in Iran, later moved to the UK, where you got a doctorate degree at Exeter University. You are today the Marie Curie Fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. Welcome to the European Report. And on my left-hand side, I have a familiar face, Charlie Weimers, Swedish member of the European Parliament, representing the Swedish Democrats in Sweden, and here in the European Parliament, the ECR group. Welcome also to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Thomas.
And Charlie, I should add that you have been a passionate defender of human rights and democracy for the Iranian people, so I know that this will be particularly appreciated in Iranian circles around in Europe and in Iran, I should add.
It's a heartfelt issue, yeah.
Thank you. As we meet here, negotiators in Vienna are meeting as well for trying to find a solution for a new nuclear agreement with Iran. Sara Bazoobandi, looking into your crystal ball for 2022, do you think these negotiations will bring about a revived Iran nuclear deal, or will it be an escalation in the tension between Iran and the Western world?
Thank you, Thomas. Well, I'm going to try to protect myself from the risk of making any predictions on Iran in any respect.
Good researchers don't look into a crystal ball, yes.
Exactly. But I'll do my best to try and formulate the future of these negotiations in the context of the philosophy behind these negotiations. From the Tehran's perspective, a good deal is a deal that has enough benefits which motivates each side to remain and adhere to the and comply with the deal, and the costs of falling through is so high for both sides that there will be enough willingness to maintain this deal in place. And I think from Iran's perspective, considering the socioeconomic difficulties, the pressure that sanction has been putting on the country, the increasing poverty level, inflation, unemployment, hit by COVID, putting all of these factors next to each other, one cannot help but expect the states to have enough motivation to want a decent deal. But like I said, it is very hard to predict, and as the negotiators said time and again, we don't have a deal until we actually do have a deal. There has been intentionally a media blackout on the details of this deal. How does it look like? How much compromise each side is willing to put into the effort, into the diplomatic effort to get to a satisfactory result. And I think the most important factors from the government in Iran is to see some viable economic and financial results out of this deal. So as long as the West and the other negotiators are willing to offer such benefits, such so-called sweetness to the deal, then yes, I would remain hopeful to the future. But of course, what we hear these days is that the development is quite slow, especially the most difficult parts to get to agree on with each other on anything, i.e. here being Iranians and Americans, they don't even stay in the same building. Mediators have to run back and forth between the two buildings trying to resolve the issues. So this slows things down. It creates a whole host of other challenges. But I would say that there is definitely enough incentive and enough motivation to get into a deal.
Thank you. We will get back to that question in just a few more minutes, but I also like to hear from Charlie, because European Union, of course, with Federica Mogherini, played a key role last time they were negotiating an agreement. What is the role of the European Union, would you say, today?
Well, I think that the EU, to a high degree, builds upon the previous work in this field. But I think it's time for the EU to actually take stock and draw some conclusions from the JCPOA last time. Let's remember what High Representative Mogherini said, that the JCPOA is crucial for the security of the region, and that a successful implementation will ensure that Iran's nuclear program remains peaceful. Well, we can only go back to the slogans of the people of the protests in 2019-2020 to see what the Iranian regime did with the economic windfall that the JCPOA and sanctions relief actually meant for the regime. And I can quote some of the protesters: "No to Gaza, no to Lebanon. We sacrifice our lives for Iran. The supreme leader lives like a god. We, the people, live like beggars. We have no money or fuel. To hell with Palestine." These were the chants on the streets of Iran at the time. And it tells us what we need to know about the priorities of the regime. They didn't invest in agriculture. They didn't mitigate the spike in fuel prices, food prices that were ongoing at the time, and still causes major disruptions for in everyday life for Iranians. So that's for the first statement by Mogherini. The other one, that Iran's nuclear program will remain peaceful. Well, if it was peaceful, then it surely would have been the most cost-efficient option for Iran in securing a stable energy delivery for its country. Well, it's not. I mean, it would be so much more efficient for Iran to invest in for instance, its oil production and make that more efficient, but it's not doing that. And that tells us what the real intent of this program is. It's not peaceful. So the EU needs to wake up to reality here, but it's not. It's clinging on to the JCPOA. It needs to understand that the JCPOA was badly constructed, and now it's dead, because the facts on the ground have changed. I mean, the Iranians, the regime has used this time to increase its work with highly enriched uranium, with denying UN inspectors access to its premises. It has built uranium metal, which is used for the core of a nuclear weapon, and as well as advancing its work on centrifuges. So the EU should reassess, and quickly. But having said that, I'm not against a New Deal, but it has to take all this into account, and it also has to take the conventional missile program of Iran into account, which the JCPOA failed to do.
Thank you, Charlie. And we have to remember, of course, that Israel is, of course, sometimes called our first line of defense. And in Israel, they are very worried about the slow progress in the negotiations. But also, to quote Prime Minister Bennett this morning, who tweeted that we have to remember that Israel is not a part of a potential agreement, and Israel will keep all their options open to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear capabilities. At the same time, we see a more conciliatory tone from Jerusalem, and especially the foreign minister have said that, even for Israel, they like to see a deal and they like to be constructive and work together. But nevertheless, we have to remember that Israel has always been crystal clear as to what they see as an existential threat to their existence, that they will keep this option of operating on their own if nothing else will help. But turning over to you again, Sara, and you can give a very interesting perspective. First and foremost, intellectually, academically, you are a full-time researcher, but also you grew up in Iran, you know the people there, you have family in Iran. What would you say, what would ideal agreement look like? And are you hopeful, and do you think that there is something that could meet the requirements of both sides?
Well, as far as the people are concerned, of course, the most important priority for the people is their well-being, which has been hit so hard by the sanctions that are the results of those nuclear aspirations directly. Yeah. President Rouhani, in his campaign, in his election campaign, promised the people that he's going to deliver a deal. He said, I'm going to bring back the value of your passports, i.e. normalization of diplomatic relationship between Iran and the rest of the world, and I'm going to bring back the value of your national currency, i.e. betterment of the economy. Well, he failed miserably in doing that, not just because President Trump decided to withdraw from JCPOA, but also because of a whole hosts of badly managed and badly made economic policies and choices. Corruption, reallocation of resources, prioritization in places that they shouldn't have. Creating a very, very strong rent-seeking system under the Rouhani administration. So all of these factors together made him fail in delivering his campaign promises. Then President Raisi tried to cleverly position himself in a different angle in his election campaigns. And he promised that I'm not going to link the livelihood of the Iranian people with the future of negotiations with the West, i.e. I'm going to diversify economic interests and economic options for Iran with the rest of the world, that if the US or the EU decided to carry on with the sanctions, we will not have any problems, or at least we will be able, realistically speaking, to control the damage. And of course, the government has been active in trying to, even under Rouhani's administration, trying to find alternatives, signing long-term deals that provides economic and security cooperation mechanisms with China, with Russia. They even went all along to getting into oil swap, for example, deals with Venezuela. Venezuela on the other side of the planet, yet is a viable, apparently, partner for oil swap for Iran. So they have been active trying to readjusting the economic interests. They have been active in trying to find alternative. But ultimately, what people see is that one tweet by a chief negotiator, whether Iranian or otherwise, can actually create 3-5% of fluctuation of the national currency's value. So whether President Raisi wants to admit it or not, whether he is successful in finding alternatives, the future of domestic economy in Iran is closely linked with the future of negotiations. A good deal, therefore, for the people would be a deal that can maintain their economic securities. People have seen the value of their assets falling quite significantly over a very short span of time. Inflation is crushing people. The poverty is increasing. People are getting bankrupt left, right, and center. People cannot. They have assets, but they cannot liquidate their assets. So all of this, from the perspective of an average Iranian citizen, they don't really care about the uranium enrichment level. They don't care about how many centrifuges Iran has. They care about whether they can meet their ends, whether they can bring food to their table, whether they can send their children to school, whether they can go on holidays or not. And people see that their livelihood is shrinking, and therefore a good deal in any shape or form would be a deal that can bring back some of the economic relief that they need to see a better prospect for their lives.
Sara, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned something very interesting, which has to do with different culture, and you called it the bazaar mentality of negotiating, whereas in Europe, and perhaps especially in Northern Europe, what has been agreed on is agreed on, and then you are very rigid in a way how you move forward. But would you want to elaborate what you mean by a bazaar mentality and how it is relevant to the nuclear negotiations?
Yes, so especially in this time, in this round of negotiations, what we saw initially was a very hard stand from the Iranians, showing, or at least portraying, that they are willing to walk away at any given point without the fear of everything falling through. And they went as far as saying that I think he is now the media advisor, if I'm not mistaken, of the Iranian negotiation team, Dr. Ali Marandi, who is a U.S. citizen himself, surprisingly, and have grown up in the United States, studied in the United States, and yet he is now taking a very anti-U.S., anti-West stand in the Iranian negotiation side. He came out and very openly, only a couple of weeks ago, said even if the negotiations fall through, Iranians have nothing to worry about. So these were all signals. Of course, in the beginning of the negotiations, they were trying to play hard to get. They were trying to show that they are very rigid in their demands. They are not going to make compromises. But a few days ago, the Supreme Leader had given a public speech, and he mentioned that collaboration and cooperation, sitting down with the global community, doesn't necessarily mean surrendering to their demands. So to me, these are the sort of signals that confirms that bazaar mentality. In the beginning, they are willing to come in quite strongly, willing to even pull out at any minute, but in reality, they are keen to get a deal.
So it's a little bit like a poker game, who will keep their face. And Charlie, perhaps away from the technicalities, these negotiations are highly complex, and I think for many of our viewers, it's difficult to understand everything that is at stake. But here we are dealing with an Islamic Republic of Iran, and I know that this is something that you have been engaged with for many years. And so the question is, who are the people that we are dealing with? And you are a lot in contact with activists inside Iran and outside of Iran. And what is the story that you hear? What is the story that needs a voice here in the European Parliament, and especially now as we are sitting down with the Iranians and trying to find an agreement?
Well, that's a complex question, Tomas. What we're dealing with is a kleptocracy under the banner of Islamism, which paves the way today for a more or less complete overtaking of the economy by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is stifling entrepreneurship and creating a whole lot of problem for normal Iranians. And it's a regime that by design is subduing the Iranian people, that will never care about human rights as understood by us, that by its design will wreak havoc in the region, because that's its stated goal, to spread their glorious ideology in the whole of the Middle East, no matter if people want it or not. The Iranians less and less want it. I mean, even in the most religious cities, and correct me if I'm wrong, but mosque attendance is dropping. It's like attendance in state churches of Finland and Sweden. Then people will know how low it is. So the ideological fundamentals of the Iranian regime is really much weaker than a few decades ago. But the will of the regime is still to play a bigger role, because as long as it can continue to shoot protesters on the streets, as long as it can continue to fund movements outside its borders, it will do so. And the EU needs to understand this, because we tend to treat, or the European leaders, they tend to treat Iran from a purely short-sighted economical point of view. That we want to increase trade here and now with this very dysfunctional regime, with a non-market economy, instead of looking beyond that. What could Iran be without this regime? What level of trade could we have with Iran as a country built upon the will of its population, where the kleptocracy is gone? Much more trade, I'd say, and we would have we would also have a country that would serve as a protector of order in the Middle East, rather than the belligerent actor it is today. So this is how I see the country, and I mean, much more can be said, obviously.
Yeah. No, I think you said a lot of things already, and let us also reiterate what Tehran has said in relation to the Jewish people, in relation to Israel, and to remember that we are today 1 week away from the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference, which coordinated the final solution, and we are 2 weeks away from the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I think the red lines in the international community should remain that it cannot be acceptable to call for the destruction of another country, for the Jewish state, keeping in mind the pledges that we have made, never again. And we need to keep them accountable in the international arenas. We also have to reiterate not only these calls for the destruction, but also what they called world scientific conferences studying the fake reality of the Holocaust. They're basically denying or trivializing that there was such a thing as a Holocaust, and then they even go to the point of having competitions in caricatures. How can you make something fun out of this? So this is for us something which is non-negotiable, and I think for the European Union and for the Western world, we need to be have much more moral courage to state this clearly, that what we expect of someone that we would entrust even in these negotiations. So I think that's an important point to make, as I say, here in the European Parliament, which in a way was founded on the ashes of the Holocaust. But coming over to you, Sara, and looking a little bit at European policy, and we have, especially in Sweden, in your country, there's something called a feminist foreign policy. You are a woman, you are Iranian. I'm not going to ask you if you're a feminist, but I'd like to your comments to see, well, how much is this empowering the women in Iran?
Unfortunately, I would say not much. The reason being that the European values and the European principles that, as you rightly mentioned, this very building is built upon, have often been overlooked, to say the very least, in relations with authoritarian regimes across the region. And that doesn't only apply to Iran, it applies to a whole host of countries in that part of the world, unfortunately. Practically speaking, I think the priority of many European policymakers is to maintain a relatively peaceful relationship, to maintain the dialogue, whether this dialogue has trickle-down effect that benefits the people of those communities, it benefits the situation of women, minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, you name it. We have all sorts of issues in that part of the world. Whether these policies lead into anything viable and meaningful for those communities or not, unfortunately, I have to say I remain skeptical, because I do not see a positive impact of this two-way dialogue that Europe is really keen on maintaining. The flip side of that is that the European policymakers would say, well, if we don't do this, then we are going to not have any access. They're going to stop wanting to even talk to us. Then that would be even a worse situation. So it's sort of a situation in which I'm not sure through which policies the European community can come out of. Perhaps Charlie would be in the best position to enlighten me on that. But I would say that as far as the current situation stands, there is very little done from the European side to improve all of those situations that you mentioned.
Charlie, you have 1 minute, a little bit less, to give a message to the negotiators in Vienna, and perhaps also include what Sara just said. How can we be coherent in our policies to promote these not only European values, but European universal values, I should say? Mm-hmm.
I would say that the first step the EU should take is to show moral support for the people of Iran. Mm-hmm. I mean, the foreign minister of Sweden, she went to Iran, she took on a hijab, and she said, when in Rome, do as the Romans. Well, when the Islamic Republic leadership came to Europe, she accepted that they refused to shake her hand. Mm-hmm. They didn't do as the Romans when in Rome. Mm-hmm. So they are treating this leadership as if they were from another planet. Mm-hmm. They're not. Mm-hmm. They are very well aware about the women's movement in Iran, and they would be very stressed by the EU bringing this up. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. The message to the negotiators in Vienna should be to end the idea of a revived JCPOA, mm-hmm. and instead strive for a new accord which has enough safeguards in terms of allowing UN inspectors access, which restrict the uranium enrichment under 3.67%. Now it's up to 60%. But the main message, I think, would be to reassess the relationship with the leadership of Iran in total, and understand that this is currently a force for destabilization, a country that could be a force for stability in the region.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Sara. And with these wise words, hear, Vienna. And I hope that they will take this into account as they try to finalize an agreement. And as we said, an agreement that would be in the interest of the Iranian people, not necessarily the regime, but the people, and for all other peoples that like to live in peace and live according to our universal values. This was the European report for this month. We are looking forward to see you again next month, hopefully then with our journalist Marco Gombaci here at my place. But from Brussels, we say shalom and auf Wiedersehen, and see you next month.